Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 6, The Long Winter. Chapter 21, The Hard Winter. The sun shone again next morning and the winds were still. The day seemed warmer than it was because the sunshine was so bright. "This is a beautiful day," Ma said at breakfast, but Pa shook his head.
"The sun is too bright," he said. "I'll get a load of hay as soon as I can, for we'll need plenty on hand if another storm comes."
And he hurried away. Anxiously, from time to time, Ma or Laura or Carrie peeped out through the frosty window to see the northwestern sky. The sun still was shining when Pa came safely back, and after the day's second meal of brown bread and potatoes, he went across the street to hear the news. In a little while, he came gaily whistling through the front room and burst into the kitchen singing out,
"Guess what I got?"
Grace and Carrie ran to feel the package he carried. It feels like, Carrie said, but she did not quite dare to say what it felt like for fear she was mistaken.
"It's beef,"
Pa said.
4 pounds of beef, to go with our bread and potatoes."
He handed the package to Ma. "Charles, how did you get beef?" Ma asked, as if she could not believe it.
"Foster butchered his oxen,"
Pa answered.
"I got there just in time. Every last bit, to bones and gristles, sold 25 cents a pound. But I got 4 pounds, and here it is. Now we'll live like kings."
Ma quickly took the paper off the meat. "I'll sear it all over well and pot roast it," she said. Looking at it made Laura's mouth water. She swallowed and asked, "Can we make a gravy, Ma, with water and brown flour?" "Indeed I can," Ma smiled. "We can make this last a week for flavoring at least, and by that time the train will surely come, won't it?" She looked smiling at Pa. Then she stopped smiling and quietly asked, "What is it, Charles?"
"Well,"
Pa answered reluctantly.
"I hate to tell you."
He cleared his throat.
"The train isn't coming."
They all stood looking at him. He went on,
"The railroad has stopped running trains till spring."
Ma threw up her hands and dropped into a chair. "How can it, Charles? It can't. It can't do that. Till spring. This is only the 1st of January.
"They can't get the trains through," said Pa. "They no sooner get a train through a cut than a blizzard comes and snows it in again. They've got 2 trains between here and Tracy snowed under between cuts. Every time they cleared a cut, they threw up the snow on both sides, and now all the cuts are packed full of snow to the top of the snowbanks. And at Tracy, the superintendent ran out of patience."
"Patience?" Ma exclaimed. "Patience? What's his patience got to do with it, I'd like to know? He knows we're out here without supplies. How does he think we're going to live till spring? It isn't his business to be patient. It's his business to run the trains."
"Now, Caroline," Pa said.
He put his hand on her shoulder, and she stopped rocking and rolling her hands in her apron.
"We haven't had a train for more than a month, and we are getting along all right," he told her.
"Yes," Ma said.
"There's only this month, and February's a short month, and March will be spring,"
Pa encouraged her. Laura looked at the 4 pounds of beef. She thought of the few potatoes left, and she saw the partly filled sack of wheat standing in the corner. "Is there any more wheat, Pa?" she asked in a low voice.
"I don't know, Laura,"
Pa said strangely.
"but don't worry. I bought a full bushel, and it's by no means gone."
Laura could not help asking, "Pa, you couldn't shoot a rabbit?" Pa sat down before the open oven and settled Grace on his knee.
"Come here, Half Pint," he said, "and you too, Carrie. I'm going to tell you a story."
He did not answer Laura's question. She knew what the answer was. There was not a rabbit left in all the country. They must have gone south when the birds went. Pa never took his gun with him when he was hauling hay, and he would have taken it if he had ever seen so much as one rabbit's track. He put his arm around her as she stood close against Carrie on his knee. Grace cuddled in his other arm and laughed when his brown beard tickled her face as it used to tickle Laura's when she was little. They were all cozy in Pa's arms, with the warmth from the oven coming out pleasantly.
"Now listen, Grace and Carrie and Laura," said Pa, "and you too, Mary and Ma. This is a funny story."
And he told them the story of the superintendent. The superintendent was an Eastern man. He sat in his offices in the East and ordered the train dispatchers to keep the trains running. But the engineers reported that storms and snow stopped the trains. "Snowstorms don't stop us from running trains in the East," the superintendent said. "Keep the trains running on the western end of the division. That's orders." But in the West, the trains kept stopping. He had reports that the cuts were full of snow. "Clear the cuts," he ordered. "Put on extra men. Keep the trains running. Hang the costs." They put on extra men. The costs were enormous, but still the trains did not run. Then the superintendent said, "I'll go out there and clear those tracks myself. What those men need is someone to show them how we do things in the East." So he came out to Tracy in his special car, and he got off there in his city clothes and his gloves and his fur-lined coat, and this is what he said. "I've come out to take charge myself," he said. "I'll show you how to keep these trains running." In spite of that, he was not a bad fellow when you knew him. He rode out in the work train to the big cut west of Tracy, and he piled out in the snow with the work crew and gave his orders like any good foreman. He moved that snow up out of the cut in double quick time, and in a couple of days the track was clear. "That shows you how to do it," he said. "Now run the train through tomorrow and keep it running." But that night a blizzard hit Tracy. His special train couldn't run in that blizzard, and when it stopped blowing, the cut was packed full of snow to the top of the snowbanks that he'd thrown up on both sides. He got right out there with the men again, and again they cleared the cut. It took longer that time because they had to move more snow, but he got the work train through just in time to be snowed under by the next blizzard. You had to admit that the superintendent had stick-to-itiveness. He tackled the cut again and got it cleared again, and then he sat in Tracy through another blizzard. This time he ordered 2 fresh work crews and 2 locomotives with a snowplow. He rode out to the Tracy cut on the first locomotive. The cut rose up like a hill now. Between the snowbanks that he'd thrown up on both sides of them, the blizzard had packed earth and snow, frozen solid, 100 feet deep and tapering off for a quarter of a mile. "All right, boys," he said, "we'll clear her out with picks and shovels till we can run the snowplows through." He kept them at it, double quick and double pay, for 2 days. There was still about 12 feet of snow on the tracks, but he had learned something. He knew he would be lucky to get 3 clear days before blizzards, so on the 3rd morning he was going to run the snowplows through. He gave his orders to the 2 locomotive engineers. They coupled the locomotives together with the snowplow in front and ran the work train out to the cut. The 2 work crews piled out, and in a couple of hours of fast work they moved another couple of feet of snow. Then the superintendent stopped the work. "Now," he ordered the engineers, "you boys back down the tracks at full 2 miles and come ahead from there with all the steam pressure you've got. With 2 miles to get up speed, you ought to hit this cut at 40 miles an hour and go through her clean as a whistle." The engineers climbed into their locomotives. Then the man on the front engine got down again. The men of the work crews were standing around in the snow, stamping their feet and beating their hands to keep warm. They crowded in to hear what the engineer was going to say, but he walked up to the superintendent and said it just the same. "I quit," he said. "I've been driving a locomotive for 15 years, and no man can call me a coward. But I'm not taking any orders to commit suicide. You want to send a locomotive up against 10-footed frozen snow at 40 miles an hour, Mr. Superintendent. You can get some other man to drive it. I quit right here and now." Pa paused, and Carrie said, "I don't blame him." "I do," said Laura. "He oughtn't to quit. He oughtn't to figure out some other way to get through. If he thinks that way won't work, I think he was scared." "Even if he was scared," Mary said, "he ought to do what he was told. The superintendent must know best what to do, or how would he be the superintendent?" "He doesn't know best," Laura contradicted, "or he'd be keeping the train running." "Go on, Pa, go on," Grace begged. "Please, Grace," Ma said. "Please," said Grace. "Go on, Pa. What happened next?" "Yes, Pa, what did the superintendent do then?" Mary asked. He fired him," Laura said. "Didn't he, Pa?" Pa went on.
"The superintendent looked at that engineer, and he looked at the men standing around listening, and he said,
'I've driven a locomotive in my time, and I don't order any man to do anything I won't do myself. I'll take that throttle.'
He climbed up into the locomotive, and he set her in reverse, and the 2 locomotives backed off down the track. The superintendent kept them backing for a good long 2 miles till they looked smaller than your thumb far off down the track. Then he signaled with the whistle to the engineer behind, and they both put on the steam power. Those locomotives came charging down that 2 miles of straight track with wide open throttles, full speed ahead, and coming faster every second. Black plumes of coal smoke rolled away from behind them, headlights glaring bigger in the sunshine, wheels burring faster, faster, roaring up to 50 miles an hour. They hit that frozen snow.
What happened then, Pa? Carrie asked, breathless.
Then up rose a fountain of flying snow that fell in chunks for 40 yards around. For a minute or two, no one saw anything clear. Nobody knew what had happened. But when the men came running to find out, there was the second locomotive buried halfway in the snow and the engineer crawling out its hind end. He was considerably shaken up, but not hurt badly enough to mention.
Where's the superintendent? What happened to him? They asked the engineer. All he said was, how the dickens do I know? All I know is I'm not killed. I wouldn't do that again,
he said.
Not for $1 million in gold.
The foremen were shouting to the men to come on with their picks and shovels. They dug the snow loose from around the second engine and shoveled it away. The engineer backed it out and down the track out of the way while the men dug furiously into the snow ahead to come at the first engine and the superintendent. In hardly any time at all, they struck solid ice. That first locomotive had run full speed head on into that snow its full length. It was hot with speed and steam. It melted the snow all around it, and the snow water froze solid in the frozen snow. There sat the superintendent, madder than a hornet, inside the locomotive, frozen solid in a cake of ice.
Grace and Carrie and Laura laughed out loud. Even Ma smiled. The poor man, Mary said. I don't think it's funny. I do, said Laura. I guess now he doesn't think he knows so much. Pride goes before a fall, said Ma. Go on, Pa, please, Carrie begged. Did they dig him out?
Yes, they dug down and cracked the ice and broke a hole through it to the engine, and they hauled him out. He was not hurt, and neither was the locomotive. The snowplow had taken the brunt. The superintendent climbed out of the cut and walked back to the second engineer and said, Can you back her out? The engineer said he thought so.
All right, do it, the superintendent said.
He stood watching till they got the engine out. Then he said to the men,
Pile in, we're going back to Tracy. Work shut down till spring.
You see, girls, said Pa, the trouble is he didn't have enough patience.
Nor perseverance, said Ma.
Nor perseverance, Pa agreed. Just because he couldn't get through with shovels or snow plows, he figured he couldn't get through at all, and he quit trying. Well, he's an Easterner. It takes patience and perseverance to contend with things out here in the West.
When did he quit, Pa? Laura asked.
This morning. The news came on the electric telegraph, and the operator at Tracy told Woodworth how it happened.
Pa answered.
Now I must hustle to do the chores before it's too dark.
His arm tightened and gave Laura a little hugging shake before he set Carrie and Grace down from his knees. Laura knew what he meant. She was old enough now to stand by him and Ma in hard times. She must not worry. She must be cheerful and help to keep all their spirits up. So when Ma began to sing softly to Grace while she undressed her for bed, Laura joined in the song. Oh, Canaan, bright Canaan, I'm bound for the... Sing, Carrie, Laura said hurriedly. So Carrie began to sing. Then Mary's sweet soprano came in. On Jordan's stormy banks I stand and cast a wistful eye on Canaan's bright and shining strand where my possessions lie. O Canaan, bright Canaan, I'm bound for the happy land of Canaan. The sun was setting so red that it colored the frosted window panes. It gave a faintly rosy light to the kitchen where they all sat undressing and singing by the warm stove. But Laura thought there was a change in the sound of the wind, a wild and frightening note. After Ma had seen them all tucked in bed and had gone downstairs, they heard and felt the blizzard strike the house. Huddled close together and shivering under the covers, they listened to it. Laura thought of the lost and lonely houses, each one alone and blind and cowering in the fury of the storm. There were houses in town, but not even a light from one of them could reach another. And the town was all alone in the frozen endless prairie, where snow drifted and winds howled and the whirling blizzard put out the stars and the sun. Laura tried to think of the good brown smell and taste of the beef for dinner tomorrow, but she could not forget that now the houses in the town would be all alone till spring. There was half a bushel of wheat that they could grind to make flour, and there were the few potatoes, but nothing more to eat until the train came. The wheat and the potatoes were not enough.
Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 6, The Long Winter. Chapter 22, Cold and Dark.
That blizzard seemed never to end. It paused sometimes, only to roar again quickly and more furiously out of the northwest. 3 days and nights of yelling shrill winds and roaring fury beat the dark, cold house and ceaselessly scoured it with ice sand. Then the sun shone out, from morning till noon perhaps, and the dark anger of the winds and icy snow came again. Sometimes in the night, half awake and cold, Laura half dreamed that the roof was scoured thin. Horribly, the great blizzard, large as the sky, bent over it and scoured with an enormous invisible cloth round and round on the paper-thin roof, till a hole wore through, and squealing, chuckling, laughing, a deep ha-ha, the blizzard whirled in. Barely in time to save herself, Laura jumped awake. Then she did not dare to sleep again. She lay still and small in the dark, and all around her the black darkness of night, that had always been restful and kind to her, was now a horror. She had never been afraid of the dark. "I am not afraid of the dark," she said to herself over and over. But she felt that the dark would catch her with claws and teeth if it could hear her move or breathe. Inside the walls, under the roof where the nails were clumps of frost. Even under the covers where she huddled, the dark was crouched and listening. Daytimes were not so bad as the nights. The dark was thinner then, and ordinary things were in it. A dark twilight filled the kitchen and the lean-to. Mary and Carrie took turns at the coffee mill that must never stop grinding. Ma made the bread and swept and cleaned and fed the fire. In the lean-to, Laura and Pa twisted hay till their cold hands could not hold the hay to twist it and must be warmed by the stove. The hay fire could not keep the cold out of the kitchen, but close to the stove the air was warm. Mary's place was in front of the oven with Grace in her lap. Carrie stood behind the stovepipes, and Ma's chair was on the other side of the stove. Pa and Laura leaned over the stove hearth into the warmth that rose upward. Their hands were red and swollen. The skin was cold and covered with cuts made by the sharp slew hay. The hay was cutting away the cloth of their coats on the left side and along the underneath of the left coat sleeves. Ma patched the worn places, but the hay cut away the patches. For breakfast, there was brown bread. Ma toasted it crisp and hot in the oven, and she let them dip it in their tea. "It was thoughtful of you, Charles, to lay in such a supply of tea," she said. There was still plenty of tea, and there was still sugar for it. For the second meal of the day, she boiled 12 potatoes in their jackets. Little Grace needed only one. The others had 2 apiece, and Ma insisted that Pa take the extra one. "They're not big potatoes, Charles," she argued, "and you must keep up your strength. Anyway, eat it or eat it to save it. We don't want it, do we, girls?" "No, Ma," they all said. "No, thank you, Pa. Truly, I don't want it." This was true. They were not really hungry. Pa was hungry. His eyes looked eagerly at the brown bread and the steaming potatoes when he came from struggling along the clothesline in the storm. But the others were only tired, tired of the winds and the cold and the dark, tired of brown bread and potatoes, tired and listless and dull. Every day, Laura found time to study a little. When enough hay was twisted to last for an hour, she sat down by Mary between the stove and the table and opened the school books. But she felt dull and stupid. She could not remember history, and she leaned her head on her hand and looked at a problem on her slate without seeing how to solve it or wanting to. "Come, come, girls, we must not mope," Ma said. "Straighten up, Laura and Carrie. Do your lessons briskly, and then we'll have an entertainment." "How, Ma?" Carrie asked. "Get your lessons first," said Ma. When study time was over, Ma took the independent 5th reader. "Now," she said, "let's see how much you can repeat from memory. You first, Mary. What shall it be?" "The Speech of Regulus," said Mary. Ma turned the leaves until she found it, and Mary began. "Ye doubtless thought, for ye judge of Roman virtue by your own, that I would break my plighted oath rather than, returning, brook your vengeance." Mary could repeat the whole of that splendid defiance. "Here in your capital do I defy you. Have I not conquered your armies, fired your towns, and dragged your generals to my chariot wheels, since first my youthful arms could wield a spear? The kitchen seemed to grow larger and warmer. The blizzard winds were not as strong as those words. You did that perfectly, Mary, Ma praised her. Now, Laura. Old Tubal-Cain, Laura began, and the verses lifted her to her feet. You had to stand up and let your voice ring out with the hammer strokes of old Tubal-Cain. Old Tubal-Cain was a man of might in the days when the earth were young. By the fierce red light of his furnace bright, the strokes of his hammer rung. Pa came in before Laura reached the end.
Go on, he said. That warms me as much as the fire.
So Laura went on while Pa got out of his coat that was white and stiff with snow driven into it and leaned over the fire to melt the snow frozen in his eyebrows, and sang, Hurrah for Tubal-Cain, our staunch good friend is he, and for the plowshare and the plow, to him our praise shall be. But while oppression lifts its head, or a tyrant would be lord, that we may thank him for the plow, we'll not forget the sword. You remembered every word correctly, Laura, Ma said, shutting the book. Carrie and Grace shall have their turns tomorrow. It was time then to twist more hay, but while Laura shivered and twisted the sharp stuff in the cold, she thought of more verses. Tomorrow afternoon was something to look forward to. The fifth reader was full of beautiful speeches and poems, and she wanted to remember perfectly as many of them as Mary remembered. The blizzard stopped sometimes. The whirling winds straightened up and steadied, and the air cleared above blowing snow, and Pa set out to haul hay. Then Laura and Ma worked quickly to do the washing and hang it out in the cold to freeze dry. No one knew how soon the blizzard would come again. At any moment, the cold might rise and come faster than any horses could run. Pa was not safe out on the prairie away from town. Sometimes the blizzard stopped for half a day. Sometimes the sun shone from morning to sunset, and the blizzard came back with the dark. On such days, Pa hauled 3 loads of hay. Until he came back and put David in the stable, Laura and Ma worked hard and silently, looking often at the sky and listening to the wind. And Carrie silently watched the northwest through the peephole that she made on the window. Pa often said that he could not have managed without David.
He's such a good horse,
Pa said.
I did not know a horse could be so good and patient.
When David fell through the snow, he always stood still until Pa shoveled him out. Then quietly and patiently, he hauled the sled around the hole and went on until he fell through the snow crust again.
I wish I had some oats or corn to give him,
Pa said. When the roaring and shrieking winds came back and the scouring snow whirled again, Pa said,
Well, there's hay enough to last a while, thanks to David.
The clothesline was there to guide him to the stable and back. There was hay and still some wheat and potatoes, and while the storm winds blew, Pa was safe at home. And in the afternoons, Mary and Laura and Carrie recited. Even Grace knew Mary's Little Lamb and Bo Peep has lost her sheep. Laura liked to see Grace's blue eyes and Carrie's shine with excitement when she told them. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere, the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. She and Carrie both loved to repeat in concert the Swan's Nest. Little Ellie sits alone mid the beeches of the meadow, by a streamside on the grass, and the trees are showering down, doubles of their leaves and shadow on her shining hair and face. The air was warm and quiet there. The grass was warm in the sunshine. The clear water sang its song to itself, and the leaves softly murmured. The meadow's insects drowsily hummed. While they were there with little Ellie, Laura and Carrie almost forgot the cold. They hardly heard the winds and the whirling hard snow scouring the walls. One still morning, Laura came downstairs to find Ma looking surprised and Pa laughing.
Go look out the back door,
he told Laura. She ran through the lean-to and opened the back door. There was a rough, low tunnel going into the shadows in a gray-white snow. Its walls and its floor were snow, and its snow roof solidly filled the top of the doorway.
I had to go for my way to the stable this morning,
Pa explained. But what did you do with the snow? Laura asked.
Oh, I made the tunnel as low as I could get through. I dug the snow out and pushed it back of me and up through a hole that I blocked with the last of it. There's nothing like snow for keeping out wind, Pa rejoiced. As long as that snowbank stands, I can do my chores in comfort.
How deep is the snow? Ma wanted to know.
I can't say. It's piled up considerably deeper than the lean-to roof, Pa answered.
You don't mean to say this house is buried in snow? Ma exclaimed.
A good thing if it is,
Pa replied.
You notice the kitchen is warmer than it has been this winter?
Laura ran upstairs. She scratched a peephole in the window and put her eyes to it. She could hardly believe them. Main Street was level with her eyes. Across the glittering snow, she could see the blank, square top of Hawthorne's false front sticking up like a short piece of solid board fence. She heard a gay shout, and then she saw horses' hooves trotting rapidly before her eyes. 8 gray hoofs with slender brown ankles swiftly bending and straightening passed quickly by, and then a long sled with 2 pairs of boots standing on it. She crouched down to look upward through the peephole, but the sled was gone. She saw only the sky, sharp with sunlight, that stabbed her eyes. She ran down to the warm kitchen to tell what she had seen.
The Wilder boys, Pa said. They're hauling hay.
How do you know, Pa? Laura asked him. I only saw the horse's feet and boots.
There's no one in town but those 2 and me that dares go out of town, said Pa. Folks are afraid of blizzards that'll come up. Those Wilder boys are hauling in all their slough hay from Big Slough and selling it for $3 a load to burn.
$3, Ma exclaimed.
Yes, and fair enough for the risk they take. They're making a good thing out of it. I wish I could, but they've got coal to burn. I'll be glad if we have enough hay to last us through. I wasn't counting on it for our winter's fuel.
They went by as high as the houses, Laura exclaimed. She was still excited. It was strange to see horses' hooves and a sled and boots in front of your eyes as a little animal, a gopher, for instance, might see them. It's a wonder they don't sink in the drifts, Ma said.
Oh, no.
Pa was wolfing his toast and drinking his tea rapidly.
They won't sink. These winds pack the snow as hard as rock. David's shoes don't even make tracks on it. The only trouble's where the grass is lodged and loose underneath.
He got into his wraps in a hurry.
Those boys have got the start of me this morning. I was digging the tunnel. Now I've got to dig David out of the stable. Got to haul hay while the sun shines, he joked as he shut the door behind him.
He's feeling chipper because he's got that tunnel, said Ma. It's a blessing he can do the chores in some comfort out of the wind. That day they could not watch the sky from the kitchen window. So little cold came through the snow that Laura led Mary into the lean-to and taught her how to twist hay. Mary had wanted to learn, but the lean-to had been too cold. It took her some time because she could not see how Laura twisted and held the strands and tucked in the ends, but at last she did it well. They stopped to warm themselves only a few times while they twisted the whole day's supply of hay sticks. Then the kitchen was so warm that they need not crowd around the stove. The house was very still. The only sounds were the little sounds of Ma and Mary rocking, the slate pencil on the slate, and the tea kettle's pleasant hum, and their own low voices speaking. What a blessing this deep snowdrift is, Ma said. But they could not watch the sky. Watching it did no good. If the low gray cloud was swiftly rising, they could not stop it. They could not help Pa. He would see the cloud and reach shelter as quickly as he could. Laura thought this many times, but just the same, she hurried upstairs through the cold to peep from the window. Ma and Carrie looked at her quickly when she came down, and she always answered them out loud so that Mary would know. The sky's clear and not a thing is stirring but millions of glitters on the snow. I don't believe there's a breath of wind. That afternoon, Pa dragged hay through the tunnel to cram the lean-to full. He dug the tunnel past the stable door so that David could get out, and beyond the stable he had turned the tunnel at an angle to check the winds that might blow into it.
I never saw such weather, he said. It must be all of 40 degrees below zero and not a breath of air stirring. The whole world seems frozen solid. I hope this cold holds. Going through that tunnel is no chore at all to do the chores. Next day was exactly the same. The stillness and the dusk and the warmth seemed to be a changeless dream going on forever the same, like the clock's ticking. Laura jumped in her chair when the clock cleared its throat before it struck. Don't be so nervous, Laura, Ma murmured, as if she was half asleep. They did not recite that day. They did not do anything. They just sat. The night was still too, but morning woke them with a howling fury. The winds had come again and the lashing whirl of snow. Well, the tunnel's going fast, Pa said when he came into breakfast. His eyebrows were frozen white with snow again, and his wraps were stiff with it.
Cold was pressing the warmth back again to the stove.
I did hope my tunnel would last through one of these onslaughts anyway. Gosh dang this blizzard, it only lets go long enough to spit on our heads.
Don't swear, Charles, Ma snapped at him. She clapped her hand to her mouth in horror. Oh, Charles, I'm sorry, she apologized. I didn't mean to snap at you, but this wind blowing and blowing. Her voice died away, and she stood listening.
I know, Caroline, Pa answered. I know just how it makes you feel. It tires you out. I'll tell you what, after breakfast, we'll read for a while about Livingstone's Africa.
It's too bad I burned so much hay this morning, Charles, Ma said. I've had to burn more trying to get the place warm.
Never mind, it's no trick to twist more, Pa replied.
I'll help, Pa, Laura offered.
We've got all day for it, Pa said. Everything is snug at the stable till night. We'll twist hay first, then we'll read.
Grace began to whimper. My feet's cold. For shame, Grace, a big girl like you. Go warm your feet, Laura told her. Come sit in my lap and warm them, Mary said, feeling her way to her rocking chair before the oven. After Laura and Pa had twisted a great pile of hay, sticks, and stacked them by the stove, Carrie brought Pa his big green book. Please read about the lions, Pa, she asked, and we can play The Wind is Lions Roaring.
I'm afraid I'll have to have a light, Caroline, Pa said. This print is small.
Ma lighted the button lamp and set it by him.
Now, he said, this is a jungle night in Africa. The flickering light here is from our campfire. Wild animals are all around us, yowling and squealing and roaring, lions and tigers and hyenas, and I guess a hippopotamus or two. They won't come anywhere near us because they're afraid of the fire. You hear big leaves rasping too and queer birds squawking. It's a thick, black, hot night with big stars overhead. Now I'm going to read what happens.
He began to read. Laura tried to listen, but she felt stupid and numb. Pa's voice slid away into the ceaseless noises of the storm. She felt that the blizzard must stop before she could do anything, before she could even listen or think. But it would never stop. It had been blowing forever. She was tired. She was tired of the cold and the dark, tired of brown bread and potatoes, tired of twisting hay and grinding wheat, filling the stove and washing dishes and making beds and going to sleep and waking up. She was tired of the blizzard winds. There was no tune in them anymore, only a confusion of sound beating on her ears. Pa, she spoke suddenly, interrupting his reading, won't you play the fiddle? Pa looked at her in surprise. Then he laid down the book.
Why, yes, Laura, he said. If you want to hear the fiddle, I'll play it.
He opened and shut his hands and rubbed the fingers while Laura brought the fiddle box from its warm shelter on the floor behind the stove. Pa rosined the bow, tucked the fiddle under his chin, and touched the strings. He looked at Laura. Play Bonnie Doon, Laura said, and Pa played and sang. Ye banks and braes of Bonnie Doon, how can ye bloom so fresh and fair? But every note from the fiddle was a very little wrong. Pa's fingers were clumsy. The music dragged, and a fiddle string snapped.
My fingers are too stiff and thick from being out in the cold so much I can't play.
Pa spoke as if he were ashamed. He laid the fiddle in its box.
Put it away, Laura, until some other time, he said.
I wish you'd help me anyway, Charles, Ma said. She took the coffee mill from Mary and emptied the ground wheat from its little drawer. She filled the small hopper with kernels and handed the mill to Pa. I'll need another grinding to make the bread for dinner, she told him. Ma took the covered dish of souring from its warm place under the stove. She stirred it briskly, then measured 2 cupfuls into a pan, added salt and saleratus, and the flour that Mary and Carrie had ground. Then she took the mill from Pa and added the flour he had made. That's just enough, she said. Thank you, Charles.
I'd better be doing the chores now before it gets too dark, Pa said.
I'll have a hot meal ready and waiting by the time you come in, Ma reminded him. He put on his wraps and went out into the storm. Laura listened to the winds while she stared at the blank window without seeing it. The worst thing that had happened was that Pa could not play the fiddle. If she had not asked him to play it, he might not have known that he could not do it. Ma, with Carrie crowded in beside her, sat in her rocking chair by the stove opposite Mary. She held Grace in her arms and rocked slowly, softly singing to her. I will sing you a song of that beautiful land, the faraway home of the soul. where no storms ever beat at that glittering strand, while the years of eternity roll. The wailing hymn blended with the wail of the winds, while night settled down, deepening the dusk of whirling snow.